Well, folks, thanks for tuning in again today. And we're on the road doing presentations here and there around the country. So we're in a little bit of a temporary studio today and hope that's working out for you fine. Let's get right to it as we see more and more people we're getting viewers from the US and Canada, and appreciate the support there and the comments. Just an amazing array of stuff today. Some of it is going to shock you. Some gruesome stories today, some kind of fun stories. But let me ask you a question right off the bat. How many of you have heard the name Naomi Seipt? Naomi Seipt. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that 100% correctly. Naomi is a German woman, and she has applied for asylum status in the United States out of Germany. The reason for that is she's being portrayed as sort of the anti-Greata, if you know Greta Thunberg, who is an extreme environmentalist and a bit of a darling with the leftist and culturally Marxist media. And basically, so think of Greta and then think of someone about the same age and about the same look and coming from Germany. And Naomi takes a very different view and has for a couple of years on things like climate and on things like immigration. She's been accused of being anti-woke. Oh my goodness, what a crime that is. And so much so that she has been receiving over the last couple of years, she gets death threats from groups like Antifa, and now she's being even threatened by the government in Germany because she could be running afoul of a law. They've got a beautiful law in Germany that I can tell you, as a former politician and as a recovering politician, I would love to have had a law that I could use against people who criticize me. And it's against the law in Germany and increasingly in other countries, left-leaning, to challenge the reputation of a politician. So an amazing piece of legislative protection there in Germany. But because of that, on the more serious side, Naomi has received over time serious death threats. She has to operate from undisclosed locations, and now she's officially applied to the United States for asylum because of the treatment that she gets, just because she takes views that are different than those expressed on the far left. So interesting to see if where that development goes, and if we're going to see more and more people applying for asylum in the U.S. There's some hints that that may be coming even from Canada, because right now the federal Liberals under Prime Minister Carney has legislation on the books which roughly has been translated that it could be, if you say things that trigger people or cause them to feel uncomfortable or get them upset emotionally, you could wind up in trouble. Down through the ages, of course, the very protection of free speech is based on this very premise that if you're challenging somebody and what they believe, they could be upset with that. So unless you're actually clearly enticing people to murder and to do outrageously illegal things, we should have that freedom to speak up about issues that concern us. That freedom is increasingly being eroded. Certainly in Canada, we see it in Germany. So let's see if there is a trend there among people who are going to dare to challenge the thoughts of an existing politician. Kind of scary stuff there. It's been quite broadcasted by a number of huge agencies. We're talking in the U.S., of course, and also Yahoo, and also Reuters and other places. Naomi has been talked about and the things she is going through, but it's interesting in places like Canada, where you have the heavily subsidized national television network, the CBC, you can't find a mention of Naomi Seipt. Here she's getting headlines all around the world, and CBC is ignoring that. Not uncommon, actually, for culturally Marxist media to ignore women who are not just kind of parroting the leftist lines on any particular issue. And so you see, for the same reasons in Canada, not getting all that much coverage of the Prime Minister from Japan. Again, a woman, but problem with her is she's small c conservative in her thinking. She's not a cultural Marxist, and so she doesn't get much attention. Probably she'll be getting more attention very soon because she's going to be visiting the U.S., and mainstream media there are going to be forced to cover the things she says and thinks. As the new prime minister in Japan, we'll see where all that goes. Another interesting difference in terms of how people see and say things between Canada and the U.S. In the U.S., people are much more open to the debate on, is somebody a socialist, or are they right-wing, or are they left-wing? And those labels can sometimes quickly apply and sometimes not fairly. But you really see it in the municipal elections. Municipal elections, which are taking place, many of them in Canada right now, people get elected as a mayor or councillor who are significantly to the left, hardcore socialists, but they never get labeled as that. It's because the mainstream culturally Marxist media in Canada doesn't want to alarm people. They want to do what they can to see people getting elected who kind of fit the mold of what mainstream media says a Canadian should be, which is a left-leaning, quiet individual who says sorry a lot and doesn't want to sound or look like anything American. But in the U.S., if somebody's running for the job of mayor, American citizens seem to be much more attuned to the fact that people who are elected as mayor and councillors actually have a huge impact on your life, on the cost of living, on the things that go on the types of programs that receive your tax dollars. And case in point is the huge coverage everywhere about the what could be the new mayor of New York coming up, Zoran Mandami, and I'm sure even in Canada, people have been reading about him. And he's quite openly, by most media outlets, characterized as severe left-leaning, communist leanings, definitely violent groups like some of the Palestinian groups, Hamas and others, find some kind of solace in the comments that he makes, which seem to be, again, left-leaning. So in the U.S., they're much more open about declaring if a particular candidate would be either left or right-wing. You don't see that same thing in Canada. It's interesting also the groups that emerge when there's hotly contested races going on in New York, which where traditionally the Jewish vote has been very important for people who are running for mayor. But with significant immigration into New York City over the last number of years, you can pick whether 10 years or 15 years, there's been a real shift away from the need for a mayor of New York City to be sensitive to the Jewish vote. But in this case of Mr. Mandami, his comments and his history and his past are so attuned to things that are very, very significantly anti-Israel, even anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish, and even being called anti-Semitic. So now he's got a group out there that are called his rabbi group, Rabbis for Mandami. And so that's interesting, and people listen to that. And then when they look a little closer, many of these so-called rabbis aren't even registered as rabbis, or some that are would be in the ultra-left or ultra-modern, not Orthodox groups. And even one of the leading so-called rabbis for Mandami is a transgender. She calls herself a woman. She was born as a male, and says that she's a spokesman or a spokesperson for Jewish thought. Really a lot of tough things that pop up on your screen that become hard to discern. You've got to really be willing to look deeper and push deeper on some of these stories that you see, because using this one as an example, a group pops up called Rabbis for Mandami. Everybody thinks, oh, well, that's the Jewish vote. And then you look into it and you find out there's really not too much traditionally Jewish about some of these people calling themselves the rabbis, especially on the transgender side. Also in New York, women making headlines. Dolly Lenz runs a very successful real estate business along with her daughter. She gets a lot of coverage talking about the trend of people moving out of New York City. And in fact, this is something that is monitored carefully, that when people have freedom of mobility, and this is why it's so important to have freedom of mobility, and this is why when you hear mayors talking about 15-minute cities, meaning you're going to be confined to certain neighborhood geographic friendly areas to where you live. So the very notion of mobility being restricted is something that people should be concerned about. But the flow of real estate dollars out of New York City into places like Florida and even Texas has been very significant of late, so much so that it's driving the cost up in places like Florida, in places like Texas, to the point that some of those people who were fleeing the increasingly leftist, heavily bureaucratic areas like New York City, they find the prices in Florida are already getting high, and some of them are bouncing back to New York. So something to really keep an eye on there. And you might want to track some of the things that Dolly Lenz, that's Lenz or Z, depending what side of the border you're on, is talking about. Again, in Canada, we get deprived of much media that is anything but mainstream, culturally Marxist leftist. So you may have to look further in terms of where you're getting your news, which brings me back to a point. If all you are watching is, for instance, CBC in Canada or CNN in the US, you're actually being information deprived. You could even say intellectually deprived. I tell people, if you're only watching those type of channels, you have to force yourself, if it's unpleasant to you, to watch other channels like Fox, to make sure you're getting both sides. Otherwise, you're just going to get one side of a political equation. You're going to come out warped or slanted in your thinking. If all you're reading, for instance, in Canada is the Globe and Mail, or south of the border, the New York Times, you've got to be reading other things also. In Canada, you've got to be reading the National Post, or in the US, you've got to be reading publications like the National Review. You have to beware that people report from their own perspectives. Even I do that. I try and make sure that I'm getting to you both sides now of what is being said on an issue, but nobody is without bias. So make sure that you are checking both sides of the spectrum when you're doing your news curating. That also goes for the sites that we're increasingly going to. I use ChatGPT as a source of not just information, but even as a source of debate. You can actually get into discussions on these AI networks and find out that they themselves will admit if they are left-leaning or culturally Marxist. They'll come to certain discussions in that with you. And so that's why you see, Wikipedia has, of course, infamously been seen more and more as reporting on people. You think it's just straight information, but it's significantly to the left. And that's why you have now other organizations, other AI-based information sources like Grok has now moved to Grokopedia, an Elon Musk outlet, and he openly says he's tired of the leftist approach of Wikipedia. So if you want something more centrist or more leaning in the other direction, then it's Grokopedia. And I'm suggesting to people, check out both. You're going to get different points of view. Check it out. Your brain is as good as anybody else's. And so check out both sides on these equations and then come to some conclusions. We're hearing increasingly the ongoing negative battles in Canada about the US-Canada problems on trade and the tariffs, and I've never been a big fan of tariffs myself. However, I am a fan of tough negotiating and negotiating in a way that doesn't just try and score political points. And in Canada, you'll get quick political points just by saying anything nasty about the US, whether it's true or not. Unfortunately, that can have consequences, as we're finding out in our trade arrangements, and with the Premier of Ontario publishing a now very famous ad or series of ads related to the US and they're not, what shall we say, complementary. And so people are saying, well, because President Trump has now said, because of those ads, he's not talking to anybody in Canada and negotiations are off. In fact, on a business-to-business front, if you're in Canada and you're wanting to do business in the U.S., you're going to have to just be and do what an entrepreneur should be doing anyway. You're going to have to go after that business yourself. And you may find that there's still some good openings there. Entire business has not shut down. Those in Canada who would report that it's all over and done with. For instance, a very recent announcement, Brookfield, which has a strong Canadian contingent, along with Cameco, which is a mining company, and especially on the uranium side of things, has just done a multi-billion deal with the U.S. government being partly involved financially, and Westinghouse, and this is in the area of building nuclear reactors. So don't think it's all over and done. In fact, there's some pretty big deals going on between Canada and U.S. As I say that, I still say the tariffs are not a happy circumstance, and we hope to see those get rolled back. It's part of the reason why we're seeing today the rate cut announcements at the Bank of Canada. That usually happens when an economy is appearing to be slowing down. And then the federal agency, whether it's Canada or the U.S., that has jurisdiction related to rate cuts will lower rates. That's a little bit of a way of putting the foot on the accelerator to speed up the economy. At the same time, it brings in debt with it, so it still causes inflation, and that can be a bit of a vicious circle. But look for those rates to be sensitive to moving down a bit to try and spur economic things that way. On an unpleasant side, in Canada, we always like to talk about the fact that the Americans have a real problem with their guns and with shooting people, and we're seeing increasing rates of that in Canada, and of a devastating shooting, a murder that just took place of someone in the Sikh community, the Punjabi community in Canada. His name is Darshan Singh, a billionaire and head of Can-Am International, a huge company, shot to death right in public. And unfortunately also a Punjabi singer, very popular, very well known in Canada. And that singer, Shani Natana, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, shot, not killed. But it's coming from, and they're being very open about it, the Bishnoi gang, which is a terrorist gang operating actually worldwide. But here's a case where the conservatives in Canada for a long time were pushing for the Canadian government to label the Bishnoi gang as a terrorist entity. That gives law enforcement more ability to move quickly in a preventative way. And again, though it's finally been done, the federal Liberals have always, and I've talked about this before, always been reluctant to label terrorists as terrorists. They're always among, when you see a group, whether it's Hamas or back in the early 2000s, whether it was Hezbollah, that increasingly around the world, more and more democracies label these groups as terrorists. Federal liberals around the world are probably the most reluctant of any group to call terrorists. They don't like doing that. Some people are cynically suggesting is because a large part of their voting constituency comes from people who are associated with at least the philosophies of some of these groups. I don't know, but if the Bishnoi gang had been labeled a terrorist group back when many of us were asking for that to happen, maybe some of their networks could not have become so entrenched, and the tentacles of these evil groups may not have spread so far. Just something to keep in mind. Talk about tentacles spreading. A very important, or appears to be important, scientific and health-related item coming from the journals of investigative science and medical, and that's a report, and you might want to check this out. Don't take my word for it. That vitamin C and vitamin E, which of course many people take, millions and millions of people take. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, but there's an association now between the taking of vitamin C and the taking of vitamin E with the ability of certain cancer tumors to spread, because the effect of vitamin E and vitamin C, as so-called with the antioxidant family of vitamins, is that it can actually nourish some of the roots of the cancerous cells in the body. It's like feeding them and helping them to spread. So this is recent reporting. It shouldn't be dismissed out of hand, something that people should take a look at. Go and, talk to your doctor about this, but I'm just making you aware. It's not a wacko fringe group that's bringing out this study. These are very seasoned researchers and people in the medical community and the cancer community who are saying, take a look and give it some thought. In terms of what is spreading on the stock market, when you look at the overall makeup of what's called the Standard & Poor's Index, and that's of all the companies, the public companies that register on the stock market, NVIDIA, of course, leads that pack, and they're right on the edge of becoming, for the first time in history, a company that has a value of $5 trillion. It's so gigantic. I mean, I can't even fathom those numbers, and I say that as a former Minister of Finance. But along with NVIDIA, and for obvious reasons with everything that's going on in AI, you also have Microsoft, you also have Apple, that are consistently up there in terms of the largest market cap groups. Just those three companies alone form 20% of the entire, what they call the Standard & Poor's, the S&P index. So when you hear the stock market is doing this or doing that, keep in mind that it could be any slight movement in these three companies that form the overall 20% of the whole value of the stock market. It sometimes can cloud the fact that there's a lot of good stuff, or maybe not so good stuff, happening in other parts of the economy. So keep that in mind. The entire market is really 20% of the entire value of that market, made up just of three companies. And on the area of the effect of culture and how we're affected by culture, increasingly, the young, you call it the young generation. I want to just talk for a minute about, we can kind of lose track of Gen Z and Gen this and Gen that. Gen Alpha, this is the group of people who are born between the years of 2010 and 2024, which is just a year ago. So we're talking about young, like the 14 and the preteen crowd continue to have a pretty big effect on market decisions and on advertisers. And it's interesting that thankfully we've been seeing over the last couple of years parents really rising up and getting their kids off of certain platforms like TikTok, which is, as we know, not always the best influences coming through TikTok, and these algorithms that speak directly to the very things that a particular individual or group might be sensitive to. So screen time seems to be, because many parents quite rightly are getting their kids to reduce screen time and to get off some of these other platforms. And so kids being kids, they continue to move, and they'll still find sources and platforms that are appealing to them. So Pinterest is where a lot of these kids are going. Roblox and is another platform. FaceTime, of course, continues to be strong, while their parents have moved them off of apps or platforms like Snapchat and like TikTok. What's happening there is these all advertisers and watch and are able to monitor where people are going, what they are looking at. So now some of the advertising decisions and consumer decisions are being made by watching what kids are watching on things like Pinterest. So folks, there it is. Some areas of interest for you today. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow.